Welcome to another program of the Lubar Center at Marquette Law School. I'm Alan Borsuk, and I'm pleased to have you join us. As we all know, education is a subject that's so divisive and polarized across the country. And I regret to say, I think Wisconsin is one of the leaders on that score. People around here can't agree on anything. The recent election for the state superintendent of public instruction was such a good example of that, where fighting with each other took entirely the place of serious discussion of issues. So I was entirely eager when I read recently that there was a book out called A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education, and particularly that it was written as an exchange of emails between Rick Hess and Pedro Naguera, two of the best known and smartest thinkers about education issues in the country. Rick Hess is Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He also writes the Rick Hess Straight Up column for Education Week, and he's got a long list of books and other accomplishments. And it is fair to label him as on the conservative or right side of education issues. Pedro Naguera is Dean of the University of Southern California, Rossier School of Education. He has held positions across the country in places like Berkeley, Harvard, NYU, UCLA, and author of also a number of books and a veteran observer of the scene. And it is fair to label him as being on the liberal or left side of education issues. And nonetheless, they are friends. They are eager to debate and discuss issues. And the book is one that finds more common ground than you might expect. This all said, my role here, I hope, will be mostly to be like the basketball referee who throws up the jump ball and lets the players take it from there. So I'm going to name subjects and let the two of you take it from there. I do want to welcome you and thank you for taking time to be part of this program. I suppose we should start with the news, which these days focuses on two subjects, race and the aftermath of the George Floyd trial verdict, and COVID. Let's start with the aftermath of the verdict in Minneapolis. Where do things stand now when it comes to race issues in education, efforts to make things better? On a mental flip of the coin, I think we'll start with Pedro Naguera.
This is an issue where I would hope that we shouldn't be that far apart, but we are still. I think anybody who thinks about it would recognize that the right to drive without fear of being stopped inappropriately, the right to be treated fairly by police officers. My father was a police officer for 22 years in New York. Is something that all people deserve. But it's clearly a right that many African Americans don't enjoy in this country, and several recent cases have highlighted that. I think working together to solve that problem is something that should be within our reach and in our interest to do, because as a nation, when we can't trust law enforcement, we are in fact less safe. And so, although this wasn't one of the topics we took on in our book, it's certainly a topic that matters a great deal to me. So I could say more, but I'll stop there. I think this.
Well, don't stop there. Apply it to schools. Are we at a point where progress on race-related issues of all kinds is possible or likely?
I think it is. I think it's a lot about how we frame the issues. I was just trying to explain that. I saw an article recently, someone wrote the other day that equity is somehow a threat to conservatives. And I'm wondering, how is equity a threat to conservatives? And I would say, if you frame it as a zero-sum logic, right? That is that more for some people means less for others, then okay, then maybe I can see that you might think that there's going to be more attention to children of color, less attention to white children, then that's a threat. But if you think about equity issues as really cutting across differences of race and socioeconomic status, because we're really talking about trying to address the non-academic needs of kids. We're trying to recognize that all kids have individual needs, and that what an equity lens does is allow us to look at those needs. Then kids, rural kids, kids with who are anxious or depressed, all kids come to school with needing to be in a supportive environment, and equity should be about creating that support.
Rick Hess.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I enjoyed working on this book with Pedro so much is that the way Pedro frames these questions, the way he approaches them, seems just to me so hugely constructive. We're going to disagree about particulars here, but Pedro gets, I think, the right things front and center and frames them in a way that invites everybody to talk practically about how do we do this. Absolutely, Pedro's right. Every American has a birthright to be able to walk down the street with confidence that the police are there to protect them and are not going to assault them. That's obviously not the case for all the nation, and that's a huge problem. And we need to address that. And every child, every parent has a right to send their child to school with the expectation that that school is focused on helping the child realize all of their possibilities, opening doors. That's not the case in far too much of the country. That's not the case for far too many children. So I think there's, and all of us in education, I think we're in this work because we believe that every kid has a right to that. Now, where it starts to get complicated is how do we deal with that? And I think Pedro tends to talk about some of these structural dynamics at work, and I think he's exactly right. And many of those I echo. When you look at their schools in certain communities, they are not offering advanced placement courses. We have choice systems in some places where families are left to their own devices to get the kids to the schools that work for them. That's a problem. We've got teachers who look at some kids and make assumptions going in about how these kids are going to perform. That's a problem. So I think there's lots that we can work on in good faith. On the other hand, and the reason I find Pedro so heartening to talk about this with is that I do think there are other people who are much more interested in performance art than in solving problems for kids. There are folks who want to define efforts to expand equity and opportunity as a version of quote unquote anti-racist education, which suggests that hard work is white, which suggests that linear thinking is white, which suggests that notions of personal responsibility are white, which I think does a profound disservice to Black and Latino kids, because I think they need these traits to succeed. And I think it is thing and dismissive of of shared values, which I think work well not only for American families and communities, but that are bedrocks of successful communities around the world. So I think there is so much that we can work on here together, and we'll disagree, and that's fine. But I also worry that some of this is getting by people who seem more interested in generating, exciting back and forth than in actually trying to work these things.
For so many years, let's stick with some of these areas. For so many years, decades, closing the gaps, whatever label you want to put on them. I mean, there's no dispute that white kids and affluent kids are doing better than Black kids overall, many exceptions, but overall, and low-income kids. That's been a high priority, no child left behind and so on, and yet it hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? And what do we need to do to make results, outcomes better? We'll go back to Professor Noguera.
So I'll go back to something Rick just said. We haven't addressed the opportunity gaps. It's easy to say white kids are doing better, but then if you don't look at what white kids are getting more of, that poor Black kids are not getting, then you're measuring apples and oranges. So, for example, you know, and I was just talking to someone yesterday who does this work. You can literally analyze school systems and who has access to which teachers, which courses. And what you see is racial disparities are built into the structure of the school. So if you don't get access to highly qualified teachers and courses that prepare you for college, then yes, you're always going to be at a disadvantage. If you look at the kids, and we did a study recently in Los Angeles, trying to understand why Black children were doing so poorly in schools at a time when the numbers of Black students have gone down. And we saw that there was just an array of challenges outside of school that affect these kids, from homelessness to foster care placement, et cetera. But then we flipped the question: where are Black children who are getting into the best colleges? Where are they going to school? And what do we find? Enriched learning environments, just like the ones that affluent white kids have, right? So school like King Drew Science Magnet, where kids have access to, you know, state-of-the-art science classes and great science teachers and internships. Question we should ask is, why isn't that available to more kids, right? That's the question. So sometimes we get stuck on the wrong question, like measuring differences. That's the wrong question. The real question is, how do you address it, right? And how do you start to level the playing field?
Yeah. Again, I mean, you know, I think Pedro frames these things so constructively. That's right. And, you know, some of this gets reduced to a question about what gets termed inequitable funding. I actually think there's the funding in this nation is vastly more equitable than some of the bumper stickers in the conversation would suggest. I think if you look at analyses by the Urban Institute and Brookings Institution, serious center-left think tanks, they'll show that we've addressed many of the inequitable funding issues. But it may take more than equity, more than reasonably equitable funding to serve all the kids who need assistance. Two, it matters very much how these dollars get spent. But C, even if you're spending a fair amount of money, again, to Pedro's point, you can spend these dollars, but not spend them in ways that are opening avenues of success and opportunity for all kids. You can have lots of remedial classes instead of advanced tracks in a school with the same number of staff. So there's that. Two other points I would just toss out here. One is, I think it needs to be a both and in this sense. Part of what feels like the cultural divide over this is my friends on the left want to talk about structural inequities, and those of us on the right want to make sure that we're not forgetting to talk about that education is always a handshake between parent and school, between student and teacher, and that those of us on the right want to make sure we're also talking about what students and families are doing. And it's easy to caricature. It's easy for folks, my friends on the left, to say, you're blaming the victim. You don't care about, and I think that's unfair. I think that's inaccurate. But it's easy for folks on the right to say, you don't want to talk at all about what students and families are doing here. And I hope that's inaccurate. I think we have to talk about all of this, that we have to talk about what schools and systems and policymakers are doing. And we have to talk about the obligation of student and family. The other thing here, as I would just say, is all of this tends to get heavily racialized right now. But some of the challenges we're talking about, I think, are not necessarily racial. A lot of it is about living in poverty. Whether you're talking about heavily Black communities in poverty in inner cities or heavily white communities in poverty in Appalachia, I think a lot of these same challenges exist. And again, there's an opportunity here to make sure we don't misdiagnose, that we don't think it's all about race when it's actually about making sure kids have access to the things that give them a chance to succeed. And another part of this is family status. We know that kids in two-parent households tend to do much better than kids in single-parent households, not because they're more loved, but because two-parent households have a lot more time and bandwidth and support and stability in many cases. So I think as we talk about closing these gaps, it's a mistake when these get reduced to it's all about race. We need to make sure we're thinking on what are the dimensions which are affecting kids' opportunity, to live the lives that we all want for them. I don't know, Pedro, you want to push back or add to that, man?
Well, I mean, I would agree with a lot of that. Where I think that the issues of structure and of personal responsibility interact quite a bit. So one of the myths of America is that poor people don't work hard, and most of the hardest working people I know are poor. Right? They work 2 and 3 jobs. They're not poor because they don't work hard. They're poor because they get paid very little. And I think understanding how the reward structure works, understanding how opportunity is available or not available to people. I come from an immigrant family. My parents believed in hard work. They sent neither of my parents graduated from high school. They sent all 6 of us to top colleges. Living proof that your background should not determine what you can accomplish in education. Question is, why isn't that more common? Why should the school you go to be determined by where you live? And why isn't the school where you live guaranteed to be one that offers a quality education? Those are the questions we should be asking.
I hope we'll get back to this in a few minutes, but let me throw up the next jump ball, and it's called the pandemic. And what impact it's having. In the book, Pedro, you write, and I want to focus particularly on what's ahead and whether anything good is going to come out of this. You write, Pedro, if there's a silver lining to come from this experience with respect to education, I hope it's a return to a focus on education that stimulates and inspires kids. Is there hope for good things coming out of the pandemic?
We did a webinar yesterday focused on superintendents. And one of the things I think Rick and I agree is that when you talk to people who are decision makers, who lead school systems, they're a lot less ideological. They're much more focused on practical matters. And that was one of the issues we focused. How do you balance addressing the kind of the mental health needs that we know are there, not just amongst the kids, but amongst many adults who are also afraid from having been in isolation for so long. But then on top of that, provide a quality education. And by quality, I mean something that challenges kids, something that gets them thinking deeply, that the kids resonate with, and they know this is worthwhile. We have spent so little time on that in this country over the last 20, 30 years. We focused on measuring achievement, but we're not looking at what are we asking kids to do in the classroom. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and we were doing some work together, and I was just shaking my head because the assignment is aligned with the Common Core standard and totally uninspiring. It was just the least creative assignment I could imagine. And I just wondered, why has it come to this? How did we lose the creative parts of teaching and learning that were, I don't know, it seemed to be much more available when I was a kid. So I hope that conversation comes back to education much more, because education. Here's what I know from my own experience: when you get a good education, you want more education. You read a book you love, you want to read another one. That's how it works, and we should be feeding that desire to learn in kids.
Rick,
yeah. So I think I think that all rings true. Nothing I would really take issue with there. In addition to that, a couple of things stick out for me. One, I think, it's interesting that people have had very different reactions to the past 12 months. Some parents have said, wow, this only brings home how hard teachers work. This is insanely difficult. Kids are exhausting. Bless y'all. And I'm impressed at how my school's pivoted. And then there's also a substantial contingent of parents who said, so what the heck are kids doing in school all day? When they're doing asynchronous assignments, it looks like they're doing 75 minutes of work and then they're done. When I'm watching on Zoom, lots of this seems tedious and unimpressive. And I'm wondering what is happening 7 hours a day in normal circumstances. And so I think one of the changes that's coming out of this is parents want a different relationship with school. Some parents, I think more than ever, they need the schools to take their kids and make sure that they have social and emotional supports and make sure the kids are surrounded by people who care about them. Other parents, for a variety of reasons, are saying, you know what? I like having my kid at home. I like being able to see part of what's happening in the classroom. And so I think there's going to be, at least in the next few years, a real interest in exploring new ways of configuring schooling. We know, for instance, next year, millions of parents seem unlikely to be willing to send their kids back in September. Schools should absolutely be open 5 days a week, but there's a couple million families where either because they are vaccine hesitant or immunocompromised or for whatever reason, they're not up for sending their kids. So we're going to have to figure out what accommodations for that look like. So there's a real opportunity here, I think, for rethinking. A second thing that's real different is I think the COVID was a real stress test for a lot of our policies and rules and laws. When we saw school districts last spring telling teachers, don't cover any new content in the last 2 months of the year because we're worried about equitable access. That strikes me as a fundamental perversion of the notion of equity. Equity should not mean we don't teach anybody anything. It should mean we figure out how to get kids what they need. When you saw school districts using contracts as an excuse, not to rethink how do we connect with kids, but well, here's how we're going to stick a non-teacher in schools when we go back to hybrid and have teachers teach from their house. That seems to suggest that there's something fundamentally askew about the paperwork and the policies. So I think this made evident a lot of challenges that we otherwise don't recognize about how our policies and contracts play out in practice. And I'm hoping this is an opportunity to revisit those.
I'm from Milwaukee. I'm from Wisconsin. We have still one of the most sweeping school choice climates in the country. A quarter of the kids in the city of Milwaukee who are getting publicly funded education are going to schools using vouchers, private schools, almost all of them religious. Next jump ball, school choice. This time we'll let Rick Hess go first.
Here's one I think Pedro and I have some, just principal disagreements to start. I'm comfortable with choice across the board. I don't think choice fixes schools, but I think it's an opportunity for families and educators and communities to rethink how schools should do the work in a way that's better suited to the needs of all kids. So I'm for charters and vouchers and education savings accounts and course choice and the rest. And I think, I think these are starting places. I think you can do these things in ways that are productive and solve a lot of problems and are responsible. I think you can also do them in ways that are reckless and breed bad behavior. And I think a lot of where Pedro and I kind of got into this issue in the book was where's that middle ground? Where can we expand the opportunities for families, more options for kids, while still being sensitive to the issues raised when we're spending public money in accord with a public directive to educate all kids.
So in my opinion, Milwaukee's the clearest case to show that choice is no panacea. You've had choice for longer than anybody else, and you still have so many bad schools all over Milwaukee. You're the test case to show choice is not the answer. You need to look elsewhere because, when you're choosing between bad options, those are not good choices. And if you ask most parents, and this is one of the issues that's come up a lot, why many parents are choosing now to say they'll keep their kids home. You know what one of their main reasons is? It's stressful. If you have a job and you have to drive your kid across town to get him to school, and then you're always gonna be late for work, that's stressful. You know what most parents want? They want a good school right next to where they live. That's accessible. That's what they want. When is that choice going to be available? And if that choice is not available, then we have a bunch of false choices. So, and I say this as someone who has spent time in Milwaukee. I visited schools with Howard Fuller, who I know very well. A lot of people who get in these debates, they only know one side or the other. I don't do that. I know both sides. And I know that neither side has an answer to the problem of how to educate kids.
In Milwaukee, for years now, roughly 20% of the kids in the Milwaukee public school system are rated as proficient or better in reading at all grades. But roughly 20% of the kids in the private schools are rated as proficient or better in reading for many years, and the needle hasn't budged in either program. Why is that?
That's so sad.
Yeah, I totally agree.
We really have to focus, because I've also been to a school in Milwaukee. I can't remember the name now, a dual immersion school that was excellent. What we don't do in education is look at where we're getting good results and ask, how do we take what they've done and spread that around to other schools? We don't give educators a chance to see it. And so we're working as though we're in a vacuum, and as though the solution, in medicine, we don't do that. So for example, if we come up with a cure to a certain kind of disease in New York, we'll share that in LA, we'll share it in Omaha, we'll share it everywhere. We don't do that in education. So why not? Why not share the knowledge about what it takes to create an environment where kids' needs are met, where teachers are able to support kids? Again, if we focus on how to create the conditions for teaching and learning, which is different than just measuring kids' performance, I think we end up approaching the work differently.
Rick?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on here, right? Pedro knows from Howard, as do you, that, part of the initiative for the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program back 3 decades ago was that parents felt ignored by the Milwaukee Public Schools. They felt like their concerns were not being addressed, that they had nowhere to turn. So look, I think Pedro is right. Every family, right, ideally, we want to give every family the chance to have a choice of a terrific school close by, and then they can choose whether to access it or not. The reality, of course, is that for those of us, right, the 3 of us, we kind of have that choice. When we buy our house, we choose where to live because we want to make sure that our kid has access to a good school. And so one of the reasons programs like MPCP exist is because for folks who don't have the money to up and buy a good house, buy a good school, it's a way to make sure that they have a chance to find a school that, is better for their child. So part of it is that we're always dealing in the imperfect reality. And the question is, how do we make sure in this imperfect reality that we're doing better by these kids and families? To Pedro's point, it's one of the interesting things about doing this book with Pedro is I think he and I both have something of a practical bent. We spent a lot of time talking to folks who work in school systems and states. And look, what Pedro's kind of put forward is this core question of if we can figure out what works, why don't we all do better off just trying to get more schools that work for kids instead of all of these other distractions? And one of the challenges is there's a difference, if you think about, say, public health, there's a difference between designing a vaccine that works and coming up with a program to combat childhood obesity that works. If you get a vaccine that works, you can get 3 million Americans a day lining up, get the needle in our arm, and we're protected better. A program that combats childhood obesity, a lot of it is how strictly do they operate the regimen? Is the nutritionist in the program first rate? Do they actually have good track equipment right there? So a lot of this matters how it plays out. And one of the frustrations with trying to take improvement to scale in education is some of those things we mentioned a moment ago, staffing restrictions and routine ways of doing business and existing policies and cultural norms can make it very hard in existing systems to actually replicate things that seem to be successful, even when you want to. For me, that's actually part of the possibilities of choice, is rather than wrestling with districts which just don't seem able to replicate things that work, can we build new programs, the success academies, other kind of, I think, reasonably effective charter school management organizations, programs that can take things that work and do them in one place after another with some fidelity.
In response to the pandemic, Congress and President Biden are sending billions and billions of dollars out to schools. I think I saw, what was the number, 132 billion total. Milwaukee Public Schools is in line to get almost an equal amount to its annual operating budget. Um, is this money going to be used effectively? And if it is going to be effective, what should be the guiding principles? Let's start with Rick.
Yeah, I mean, it's about, it's 130 billion in this tranche. That's on top of 65, 70 billion that was sent out last year. That's, triple, triple what Washington gives schools in a typical year, just in emergency funding. I'm relatively skeptical that this money is going to be spent effectively. I've had too many superintendents say too many things about buying lots of buses so they can socially distance in the fall, with little or no awareness to what's going to happen to those buses. 6 months or 9 months out, that they're going to have a whole lot of steel rusting in a bus yard somewhere at a cost of millions. I'm worried that schools are going to add staff, which are just going to aggravate pension and health liabilities. Pedro and I actually recently wrote a piece, which should be running soon, I'm not sure where, talking about some of the things schools can do with this money, and that it can be spent effectively. But it's not the way I would bet.
Pedro?
So this is a place where public accountability is so important. The public needs to watch how this money is spent. It needs to pay close attention to make sure that wise decisions are made. The good news is they don't have to spend it right away, so they can think through what is a strategy to have the greatest impact. But you have a governor in Wisconsin who's a former educator, former state superintendent. If this is an area where there should be some bipartisan work together. We say, let's work together to make sure the money is well spent. Let's work together to eliminate some of the unnecessary regulations so that we can give our schools a chance to improve. And where we see misspending, let's hold them accountable immediately so we don't end up with a bunch of waste. So, but it does take working together and not just throwing rocks at each other.
So, a couple, and on that, a couple of the ideas Pedro and I float, for instance, when we brainstormed on this together. One is, look, what you need is basically a lot of people right now over the next 6 or 12 months, reconnecting kids. Something like 1 out of 5 students fell off the school district's grid over this past year. They weren't logging in, they're nowhere to be seen. School districts need people who are vaccinated actually going out in the community, sitting down with these kids, sitting down with families, getting the kids back up. They need diagnostics. We don't need testing. We need to know, where are these kids in terms of, have they lost skills and knowledge? Where are they socially? Where are they emotionally? Now, what we don't need to do is add huge body counts to collective bargaining agreements. What we need are folks who are going to work for 6 or 12 months. That requires memoranda of understanding between school districts and bargaining entities. There's a need, obviously, for a huge wave of summer programs for the families who want that for their kids. But this doesn't necessarily have to be run by schools. There's a whole rich network in many American communities of various summer programs. And we need exciting dynamic programs, chess, robotics. We don't need kids sitting for 3 hours getting remedial instruction in reading and math from teachers who are as exhausted as they are. I think there's a lot of opportunities to think creatively about how you spend these dollars, but it requires districts not doing standard operating procedure. And one of the things that makes me nervous about how this money will be spent is, even during this extraordinary period of this last 13 months, it seems like we kept drifting back to standard operating procedure rather than doing what was going to solve problems for kids and communities.
Testing is one of the subjects in your book that you actually both find some agreement on. A quote from Rick: we've prioritized tests that are useful to public officials rather than those that are useful to parents or educators. Should we be doing testing at the moment, and which is a hot issue in Milwaukee right now, and going forward, what should be done with standardized testing? I think it's Pedro's turn to go first, more or less.
Well, again, testing, when it's used to provide useful information to teachers on how to support a student, makes a lot of sense, because that's how you are able to identify areas of need and hopefully intervene and address those. testing, when it's done largely to rank kids, is not very effective at all. And that's largely what we've done over the last 20 years, is we've ranked kids, ranked teachers, ranked schools. Show me how that's helped us to improve as a nation. I don't see any evidence. So it's really, again, recognizing assessment is a tool, an essential tool for education, because we've got to know how well kids are doing. But it's a tool that only works when it comes with a response, right? If I were to assess you, Alan, and find out that you're behind in a subject, and then I say, well, you're low in science, Alan, and they say, okay, what's the plan to get me better? Say, well, we don't have a plan, but we know you're low. You would say, that's malpractice, and it is. And that's what we do right now to kids. And that, I think, is something that we need to shift away from by getting the results back to teachers and parents in a timely manner, and then having a plan for how to address the areas of need.
I never was that good at science, by the way. Rick.
Yeah, I mean, I think, testing was interesting. I think one of the places where Pedro and I have a lot of common ground. Again, but because partly it's, I think, a question, I think the debate is left between like left and right. A lot of this debate has been tests good or tests bad over the last 20 years. And Pedro and I both tend to look at that and say that's not actually a useful debate. The debate is kind of, are tests actually practical, or are they serving a practical purpose or not? Any good teacher from the first moment of a school day is testing kids endlessly. Hey, what'd you think of that reading last night? Hey, did you understand this? Hey, so much of a teacher-student interaction is just a million little assessments where good teachers are trying to figure out what kids know. The problem is that stuff's not visible to anybody outside the classroom. So the logic of a lot of the accountability testing stuff was the people footing the bill for schools and families, wanted to make sure that, can we trust that schools are doing okay? So having, state assessments, grade 3 to 8, reading and math makes sense if we're just trying to keep an eye on things. The problem is that these tests that have wound up taking so much time and energy and focus aren't really about how individual kids are doing. They're certainly not about helping teachers teach kids. They're much more, like Pedro said, about kind of this high-level ranking or backstop of here's how schools are doing. And then when we started to use it to try to figure out how to evaluate teachers. And look, what we need this spring are assessments that help schools know where kids are, what they need, what they're missing, help teachers catch them up and kind of spring them forward. And testing going forward ought to be focused on, of course, we need to keep an eye on what schools are doing, but the real purpose ought to be making sure that kids are learning and that educators and parents are able to help them. And, partly it's just been, I think we have wound up spending much of the last 20 years talking about what kinds of tests are useful for policymakers to issue in a state report card, rather than talking about what's useful for parents and educators, focused on making sure kids learn things that are important.
I regret to say we're heading towards a conclusion here. So let's take a couple minutes to look at the big picture. That's the premise of the book. A Search for Common Ground is the title. Is there a way to pursue a search for common ground? I'm going to read a quote from Rick from the book, that disagreements can rage out of control. They can blot out everything else, obscuring points of commonality and the chance for mutual understanding. This exchange has reminded me of how vital and possible it is for people of goodwill to push back. Is there hope for people of goodwill? Rick?
Yeah, I think there is. It feels like the world feels crazy today, but I don't think it feels crazy because people have gone crazy. I think it feels crazy because our institutions are featuring crazy. My colleague Yuval Levin has written about how institutions have become performative platforms. So members of Congress, are more interested in using Congress as a platform to tweet than as a place to focus on actually negotiating across the aisle. When you look at social media, we know that the people active on social media are kind of the 20% of Americans who are most extreme in their views. We know that the most politically active Americans are those who are most misinformed about what their opponents actually think. We know that CNN and MSNBC and Fox feature the most extreme voices. So I think 70%, 80% of us actually want something healthier, more grounded, more practical. But our national discourse is being shaped and informed by the most extreme. And I think what we need to do is push back. And I think pushing back, especially in education, starts by those of us who sit where Pedro and I do, who have the freedom to speak our minds, platforms to speak from. We need to stop using them to kind of bang the table and shout that I'm right. And we need to spend a lot more time and energy kind of creating room to challenge unhelpful conventions on our side as well as the other side, to ask challenging questions, to model what it looks like to reach across. Because frankly, whether you're talking about schools of education or school boards or principals, I just don't think they have a lot of models of what it looks like to do this differently. It's very easy to get sucked into the vortex of vitriol, and social media. And what we need to do is create other models, other platforms, offer other avenues. And, what Pedro and I tried to do here was, one little contribution to what needs to be a much larger effort.
Pedro.
Yeah, that was why when Rick invited me to participate in this book with him, I said yes, because I think we need to model for people that constructive civil dialogue is possible, that we can do better than simply engage in, the kind of partisan battles that we see throughout the country. My hope is that this is not just an isolated activity that we've engaged in, that others will feel inspired to do something similar, whether it be in other fields. Because, this country is faced with a myriad of problems, and we're not going to get any closer to solving them if all we do is fight with each other. So, it's in the spirit of trying to figure out how do we address our common problems by identifying our common interest that I think we wrote this book. And it doesn't mean you have to compromise your values. It does mean you have to be willing to listen. And that, I think, is what we need a lot more of.
I don't hawk books, but if you perceive me to be hawking this book, I won't argue with you, because I think it's an important contribution, a search for common ground, conversations about the toughest questions in K-12 education. I really, really want to thank Rick Hess and Pedro Naguera for writing this book, putting it together, and for joining us here. And I hope you're right that this kind of conversation and exchange can grow and lead to better solutions for kids all over the country. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back with more programs ahead.